Hello, I'm Mark Kerr, the president and co-founder of the Center for Self-Governance. The topic of this presentation is the political weaponization of labels in government, with a specific focus on the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC for short. This weaponization of labels in government takes root in this diagram that we've put together to help explain to you the weaponization of labels in government and how it may affect you from a 50,000-foot view. On the left side, you see non-government organizations. That means organizations like media, SPLC, Planned Parenthood, Christian organizations, any type of organization that is not a government organization. The executive is referring to the executive branch at the federal level specifically, and Congress is obviously the House and Senate of our federal government. So in 2001, Congress passed a public definition in Title 18, Section 23031, Part 5, for a new definition called domestic terrorism. This definition was created based on the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act was created based on the September 11th attacks in 2001 that cost thousands of lives and took down the World Trade Center buildings. The phrase terrorism or the term terrorism has a public label to it, an official public label that Congress has created called terrorist. Before 2001, you could be labeled a terrorist under the condition that you were connected to a public list. And this public list was given authority, or the authority to create this list and oversee this list was given by Congress to the Department of State. It's called the Foreign Terrorist Watch List. And so you could be labeled a terrorist committing an act of terrorism if you were an American citizen providing aid and support or joining a foreign terrorist organization designated by the Department of State. In 2001, however, this law of creating a definition for domestic terrorism is ambiguous. It does not say who it specifically applies to. In other words, the interpretation is left up to the bureaucracy or the executive department. So bureaucracies like the Department of Homeland Security, for example, and the FBI have created their own internal definitions of terrorism based on the previous prior to 2001 definitions, as well as that new 2001 ambiguous definition. This has resulted in DHS and FBI, as well as other bureaucracies, to create their own bureaucratic labels for domestic terrorist. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security in March created an extremism lexicon. That word extremism is very important, and I hope you write it down. That extremism lexicon primarily focuses on right-wing extremists who would be considered Christian constitutionalists, hate groups, anti-government, and white supremacists. There was a lot of uproar during that time, and so they supposedly took down the extremism lexicon, but that's not actually the case. It's still used. You can still find it on Wikipedia. It is still referenced by non-government organizations, and particularly the media. In 2020, in a joint memorandum, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI added the word violent to the previous two words and created one label, domestic violent extremism, or DVE for short. You may have heard recently where FBI whistleblowers have come forward to Congress saying they have evidence that the FBI is overinflating their DVE cases, in particularly focusing on parents showing up to school board meetings, because the school board said they felt threatened, and the DHS created a threat reporting system, and the school board would report that threat, and then the DHS would coordinate with the FBI and label that a DVE case. Very important that you remember that label, domestic violent extremism, because it results in lists. It informs the discretion of these lists. One of them is the Foreign Terrorist Watch List. Another one is the Terrorist Watch List. In 2023, there is an individual who was in January 6th who was recently charged, has not been to court or found guilty yet, but in his discovery packet for his case, there is a be on the lookout document that says, do not inform this individual that he's on a terrorist watch list. Now, this is important for you to understand because this individual is not connected to any foreign terrorist organizations designated by the Department of State. The reason for this is because of that ambiguous law at the top right-hand corner in 2001, defining domestic terrorism and not specifying who it applies to. Bureaucracies created their own definitions for terrorism, created their own labels, and then now have their list that includes American citizens who may be practicing their political activities, but have zero tie to any foreign terrorist organizations designated by the Department of State. The second list is the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms no gun buy list. This list is designed or originally designed to prevent bad actors from being able to purchase weapons. There's a gentleman from the state of Idaho who was charged in 2014 for participating in an event in Nevada called the Bundy Standoff. His case was eventually dismissed by the Court of Appeals, and he was exonerated 100%. But to this day, since 2018, he is still on the no buy gun list. So his punishment continues despite the fact that he has been exonerated by the court system in the United States. He doesn't know how to get off the list. He doesn't know who to call. He's tried to reach his congressman, but there's no due process, not only for the gentleman who's supposedly on the terrorist watch list for going to January 6th, but for this individual on the no buy gun list who's been exonerated by a court of law. Somehow the punishment still continues. Then there's the no fly list. The no fly list is managed by the Department of Homeland Security's Transportation Security Administration, or the TSA. The purpose of this list was to prevent people like they did back in 2001 from hijacking planes and killing thousands of people and crumbling our economy for days on end. Forgive me. The no-fly list is very important because if you make the no-fly list, it affects your ability to travel. Not just not being able to travel, but when you show up. For example, you can't purchase your ticket online. You have to show up to the counter physically. And when you do, there's on the agent's screen, there's 4 S's that pop up. Their reactions non-verbally are, I'm dealing with potentially a bad actor. They're required to call somebody. TSA, marshals become involved. It affects your ability to go through security. They do extra screenings. In some cases, they make you strip down to your underwear. When you get to the gate, they hold the gate, they put everybody on, they check them, and then you're the last. And in some cases, they will handcuff you and have 2 marshals sitting between on either side of you. I'm going to give you 3 instances where this has happened to US citizens who have never been charged with a crime, never been to court or found guilty or imprisoned for anything, not even speeding tickets. There's a case of a father from Chicago participated in school board meetings. They labeled him a threat, and he ended up on the no-fly list. He had to go through 4 hours of this screening process multiple times. Even his wife and his young daughter had to go through the same screening process. It caused them embarrassment, caused them loss of money. It caused them loss of time to miss their flights, etc. When they tried to get off the no-fly list, they didn't know who to call. There was no due process, no judge to go to. They contacted their congressman. The congressman didn't even know who to call or what to do. Eventually, Congressman Matt Gaetz from Florida wrote this father a letter, and all of a sudden he got off the list. But the number one question that Matt Gaetz asked is, who's in control of the list and how does somebody get off? To that day, the answer has not been given. There is a grandmother and a mother, 2 separate individuals who are both on the no-fly list. They've never been charged, found guilty, served prison time. They don't have speeding tickets. They don't know why they're on this list, how they got on this list, or even how to get off the list. And so they don't even fly anymore. This shouldn't be happening to grandmothers and mothers in the United States. How does this apply to you? This is where Southern Poverty Law Center and other non-government organizations come into play. You might think everything on the two columns to the right, yeah, that should be done to bad guys. Well, if you don't control the definitions and you don't control the labels and you don't control the lists, eventually you can end up like Jesus or Quakers in Massachusetts or Jews in Germany. The reason why is because the definitions matter. The labels matter. In this case, the media uses the term terrorism, terrorist, and domestic terrorism over and over again when referencing anything that's right-wing. But they won't use the term terrorist, terrorism, or domestic terrorist for anything that would be categorized as left-wing. So their media reporting is biased, but it heavily influences the discretion of the bureaucracies, particularly agencies like the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. Their private definitions lead to their private labels. And this is tied directly to the domestic violent extremism label that the bureaucracies use. It's the word extreme. When you see the media reporting or you hear Southern Poverty Law Center on all of their reports, either on their website or their intelligence report, which is a magazine, et cetera, they will repeat the words extreme over and over and over again in reference to right wing. Excuse me. These labels are tied. You can find these 4 labels specifically in the March 2009 extremism lexicon created by the Department of Homeland Security. That is the extreme, hate, anti-government, white supremacy. Recently, a mother's group in the United States was labeled a hate group underneath the category of extreme, tied to anti-government militias, which is categorized on their website as white supremacy. Southern Poverty Law Center and other non-government organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and others provide training based on their private definitions, based on their private labels to bureaucratic institutions like the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. They also create their own private lists. And this is where some organizations, including ours, have experienced SPLC's list. Now, what's really important for you to understand is that SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, believes their definitions and their labels to be accurate and that their lists are based on their research of these organizations that they put on their list. And they call that intelligence, and they provide that intelligence to bureaucracies, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. Let me show you how. So SPLC specifically, their list have been used by the FBI. Specifically, this is an internal document that was not intended to be released to the public that the FBI was using to justify tripwiring and producing human sources to infiltrate 8 groups in Richmond, Virginia, practicing their First Amendment religious freedoms. This is an allegation of an airline employee who alleges that the SPLC list was being referenced by the TSA when they had to call the no-fly list because somebody had those 4 S's. You'll notice here it says in the highlighted yellow, the Homeland Security agent on the phone asked for the names. And then after answering the questions, the agent said, paused and stated, "Hold on while I check the SPLC list." This is a military facility operation security board. This is operation security means that the military this is how you inform the people on your base or your facility. Be on the lookout for enemies, safeguard military resources, always have your antennas at a high attention level. I want you to notice the bottom right-hand corner of the chart. I'm going to zoom in for you. It says terrorism, violence, religion, etc. And then below that, notice it says intelligence report. The intelligence report is created by the Southern Poverty Law Center And if you read at the bottom left-hand corner, it says that law enforcement receives a DVD on anti-government extremists. So remember those 4 private labels: extreme, hate, anti-government, white supremacy, which they tie to their private definition of terrorism. And this is an intelligence report that is on a military installations operation security board under the banners of terrorism, terror, and religion. The SPLC researcher recently, one of the organizations was labeled hate. This particular researcher is a contributor to the intelligence report and met with President Biden's national security team last week. SPLC attorney is now confirmed as a federal judge. Senators Murray and Cantwell of the state of Washington reintroduced what's called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. The reason for this is because there are no charging statutes for domestic terrorism. You can't charge an American citizen with domestic terrorism if they're not connected to a foreign terrorist organization. And so SPLC, in coordination with the senators from the state of Washington, endorsed. You'll notice here, this is off their website, and I'm sorry, off of Senator Murray's website. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act is endorsed by the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center lists organizations that have federal tax exempt numbers, which could indicate that that would mean that they are informing the discretion of the IRS. And so you'll notice that Center for Self-Governance is listed there, and many other organizations are listed with their tax ID numbers, which could mean that the IRS is having its discretion informed by this non-government organization. The Southern Poverty Law Center also provides training to federal law enforcement, and this is from a Bureau of Land Management law enforcement investigator. This document has not been given to Congress yet. I will be delivering this document to Congress next week. And specifically, you'll notice that they provide training on anti-government organizations, and that here it says that they were being paid by the Bureau of Land Management. So this non-government organization was receiving federal money to provide training to law enforcement officials in the Bureau of Land Management about anti-government organizations, extremists, etc. So I'm going to shift gears from the federal government to the state. So SPLC has direct ties to Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson, and Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, specifically in the creation of a Domestic Violent Extremism Commission and a Hate Commission. So that Domestic Violent Extremism Commission is tied to that label created by DHS and FBI, is now penetrating its way into the Attorney General's offices, who have direct connections with Southern Poverty Law Center. So you'll see here is that Dana Nessel quoted said that she would surveil 31 Michigan organizations that appear on Southern Poverty Law Center's list of hate groups. So now you not only have the federal government and its agencies and departments potentially having their discretion informed and then weaponized against American citizens, I would argue without due process, equal protection, or equal application of the law, to using the list in the state by the Attorney General, who's the chief law enforcement officer, to surveil organizations listed by SPLC on their private lists based on their private labels and their private definitions. SPLC provides training to all law enforcement officials, whether they're federal, state, or local. And this is a quote directly off of their website from the intelligence report. We train law enforcement officials and share key intelligence. I've already kind of demonstrated to you that with the federal side. They also list state representatives, specifically state representatives from states that they're highly focused on, like Idaho. Again, they provide training and intelligence to local law enforcement officials around the country. They also partner with the University of California's Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. If you want more information on those particular things, we have written a paper called How Americans Become Unwitting Domestic Terrorists. You can find that paper on that website. They also partner with corporations to cancel organizations that are labeled and listed by SPLC. Our organization is how we became activated to interact with Congress. We joined Amazon Smile back in 2018. In 2021, SPLC labeled us anti-government. And then in 2022, last year, Amazon Smile canceled our charity status without any due process. Not that they had to as a private organization, but we interacted with them. And then this year they canceled Amazon Smile. I don't know if that's because of us. We didn't intend to do that. We just were trying to make the case that something's not right with SPLC being able to cancel you without any due process. SPLC partners with public schools through their organization called Learning for Justice. I'll explain that in just a few minutes. It's the curriculum is called Teaching Tolerance, and it goes through their organization Learning for Justice, which is tied to a broad national organization called News, ELA, NEWS, ELA. And then finally, the SPLC is highly sourced by media to be credible experts on their labels and their lists. When I've researched the media and done word counts, I've found thousands of references to SPLC in media reports, specifically focusing on organizations or individuals they've labeled right-wing, extreme, hate, anti-government, and white supremacists. Okay, to summarize this, SPLC, based on our evidence, we make the case that they have weaponized the federal and are weaponizing the state and local governments to suppress the First Amendment rights of US citizens that they disagree with, while enjoying their First Amendment privileges, as well as their own tax-exempt status. These are the three websites I was mentioning to you. On the far left is their main efforts, the intelligence report. It's SPL Center, not SPLC Center. It's splcenter.org/hate-and-extremism. This is where you'll find their lists, their individuals, the groups, their Excel files, etc., on all of their labels and all of their lists. On the top right-hand corner is their interaction with the 16,000 public school districts in the United States. It's called learningforjustice.org. And this is where they deploy their primary curriculum called Teaching Tolerance. Bottom right-hand corner is their legislative arm, SPLC Action Fund, splcactionfund.org. And this is how they fund their activities legislatively to make change around the country, providing efforts regarding domestic violent extremism commissions in Washington State, hate commissions in Michigan, providing legislative solutions to local governments and state governments across the United States. So I want to reiterate, these calls to actions are Center for Self-Governance actions. If you want to join with them individually, that's up to you. But we're not calling on any organizations tied to the list, recently tied to that list to join with Center for Self-Governance calls to action. But individually, I would encourage you, and I would even urge any organizations that have been listed and those who have not been listed, your time will come. You could be a Jew helping the Nazis load the Jews onto the board, but eventually the star and the labels will be applied. So this is an urgent call to action. Number one, we would like to partner with anyone to FOIA all state and local law enforcement interactions with SPLC, especially state attorney generals and urban area law enforcement entities. That would include school resource officers, local police departments, county sheriff's departments, state highway patrol, state public safety, state health departments, and the Attorney General's office. You can go as broad and wide as you want to, but the key is to get the ball started on public records request in Washington is what they're called, but FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act. And this would allow you to seek out specific interactions with SPLC that include any communications by text, phone, email, mail. Do they receive the intelligence report monthly? Are they paying for that? Have they received any training? What kind of resources and materials did they receive? How often do they get the training? Are they paying SPLC for their time and efforts? What other non-government organizations are they receiving training on extremism, hate, anti-government, white supremacy kinds of trainings in your states and at the local level? Why is this so important? The reason this is so important is CSG is going to compile all the FOIAs that we're doing, in addition to any of the others that are sent to us, and analyze them and then prepare them for use for several reasons. Number one is to interact with the Weaponization of Government Committee at the federal level. They want the evidence. They've asked us for the evidence. They need the evidence. They're so new at this, and the Pandora's box is so wide. They just hired their first attorney about a month ago. And so they have another year and a half of investigations they can do. And with the recent revelation of labeling moms as hate groups and 12 other parent organizations, it's a big deal. They've made a huge mistake, and there's an opportunity for you to capitalize by doing public records requests for all interactions with Southern Poverty Law Center and their communications, their training, any monies that they're paid, anything you can think of in terms of interaction with the SPLC. That becomes evidence that the SPLC is no longer just a First Amendment nonprofit, but now a state actor mobilizing government against people who are exercising their First Amendment. Super critical. Finally, we'd like to invite you to join us to develop solutions with action. We're preparing our solutions with actions to present to the Weaponization of Government Committee so they can put it in their 2025 report. In the new Congress, if they have the right mixture, we'll be able to mobilize those legislative priorities and make changes. For example, Title 18, that ambiguous law on domestic terrorism, who does it apply to? Number two, the bureaucracies creating their own definitions and labels. Number three, what about all those lists at the bottom of that screen I showed you? What's the due process? How does an American get on there? Is there a court they can go to get off, or a 1-800 number they can call? What is the process to have remedy and due process regarding being put on any of those lists? And many, many other solutions that we can bring to the table. At the state and local level, I can't stress this enough how important it is that SPLC's interaction with your local and state government is ubiquitous. All 50 states have SPLC influence at the local and state level. Not all local police departments, there's 35,000 of them, have SPLC training or interactions, but the ones we can find and demonstrate a fact pattern that SPLC is not just mobilizing the federal government, but all 50 states, as well as many local police and county sheriffs departments. This becomes evidence at the federal level, but opens the door for you at the state level to make some serious reforms, build relationships with your local elected officials, your state elected officials, and start to drive policy reforms so that together we can stop the weaponization of labels in government. CSG is considering a defamation lawsuit. We've already interacted with SPLC on 2 occasions this year. In both cases, they basically have rebuffed our calls for retraction. So our organization's considering a defamation lawsuit against SPLC. If you want to join in that lawsuit, I think honestly, the more Americans who join together to say this needs to stop, the better off we'll be in being able to drive our ideas and have political participation normal again in the United States. So for more information about this matter, and other activities that Center for Self-Governance is involved in, visit our website, centerforselfgovernance.com. You can email us, call us, or follow us on all the social media platforms. I want to thank you for paying attention to the political weaponization of labels presentation, and hope that together we can stop the weaponization of labels in government in our lifetime for our kids' future.